What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, it's Friday, you know what time it is. It's time to get into the wide receiver starts and sits for championship weekend. Not only is it championship weekend for most people playing fantasy football, but we also have a jam-packed slate. This slate includes 4 straight days of football beginning today, and even looking further out at the Sunday night matchup and the Monday night matchup, they are going to have a lot of fantasy implications with players like Devontae Adams, AJ Brown, Corey Davis, and Stephon Diggs at the wide receiver position playing in just those 2 games. For that reason, it's safe to assume a lot of the fantasy championship titles are going to come down to the wire. And would we want it any other way? I don't think so. But before we move into those matchups and the stat of the day, if you guys could just give this video a big like, we would really appreciate it. Yesterday's stat of the day was which running back currently leads the league in rushing yards over expectation per attempt. The correct answer was actually Nick Chubb. Congratulations to Billy R. You were the first to get this one right. As for today's stat of the day, which quarterback has thrown the highest amount of interceptable passes on the season? Once again, that's which QB has thrown the most interceptable passes for 2020. Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. With all of that out of the way, let's head right into the first matchup. The first game we have is the Minnesota Vikings versus the New Orleans Saints, and starting on the Minnesota side of things, we have Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen heading into this matchup. We know that they are wide receiver ones on the season. Our questions and concerns aren't really with if we're starting them or not, but what should our expectations be heading into this game? Well, I will say this game has one of the higher projected totals on the week, going over 50 points. Drew Brees is also projected to be the starter heading into this game, presumably more healthy, and against a weak passing defense like the Minnesota Vikings, the potential for Kirk Cousins to have to put up some production through the air at the middle and later stages of this game, it's going to be much higher than it would with a more banged up Brees. So we have that working in the favor of the Minnesota Vikings receivers. I will say overall though that it isn't a plus matchup. Justin Jefferson, he's been on an absolute tear though. We're ranking him ahead of Adam Thielen. Adam Thielen himself is in a bit of a slump, 7 combined targets over the past 2 games. As for Justin Jefferson though, he's seen double-digit targets in 3 of his past 4. So when it comes to a safety in a floor, Justin Jefferson is certainly the player that you want to have your eye on. As for Adam Thielen, the primary red zone receiver for this team, he certainly has a good chance to score in this one as well though, so don't mark him out. The New Orleans Saints actually allow the 3rd least completions per game and the 5th least passing yardage per game, but when it comes to receiving touchdowns and red zone production, that's an area they are actually susceptible to be beaten at. They rank bottom 10 in the league. That matches up very well with the skill set of Adam Thielen, so while we still would rank Justin Jefferson a hair ahead of him, both are going to be wide receiver ones in this contest. Moving over to the New Orleans side of the ball, we have a really sneaky start in a player named Emmanuel Sanders. As we know, Michael Thomas was placed on IR about a week ago. Traquan Smith has now joined him, which is overall limiting all of the passing options available for Drew Brees. Like I had mentioned before, Drew Brees should have no problem against his passing defense, and with Emmanuel Sanders leading the top options at the wide receiver position, an area this opposing defense has allowed the 5th most fantasy points to, it all equates to a top 30 fantasy ranking for Emmanuel Sanders at the wide receiver position, and one I believe is coming into this matchup with a sneaky safe floor. The next matchup we have is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers on the road against the Detroit Lions. This game has a very high projected total, coming in at nearly 54 points, and the Detroit Lions are going to be coming in as nearly double-digit point underdogs. Similarly, as to with New Orleans, we have a quarterback in Matthew Stafford who's becoming more healthy. The consolidated target market share on this offense is going to benefit Marvin Jones similarly to the way it benefits Emmanuel Sanders, because as we know, Kenny Golladay has already been ruled out. While the Tampa Bay pass defense isn't going to be as beatable as a matchup against the Minnesota Vikings, Marvin Jones will come in with the added benefit of being double-digit point underdogs, lending itself to higher volume in the passing game late in this game. Don't get me wrong, the Tampa Bay pass defense is still one that can be beaten. They're much stronger against the run, but with the struggles that the Detroit Lions have in that area, the odds and the likeliness of them relying more on the pass in this game is going to be much higher. For all of those reasons, Marvin Jones we have ranked as a wide receiver 2 in this matchup, a high-end one at that, so if you own him, be excited to get him in your lineup, but we're not starting any other Detroit receiver outside of Jones. On the other side of the ball, for Tampa Bay, we have several wide receivers we're starting, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, as well as Antonio Brown. Each of them can be started confidently. The Detroit Lions have allowed the third most fantasy points to the wide receiver position across the season, which allows us to safely bump up all 3 wide receivers in the rankings. Mike Evans is going to be on the cusp of a wide receiver 1 ranking this week. Chris Godwin can be considered a safe floor wide receiver 2, and Antonio Brown, who's coming off by far his best fantasy performance since being a Buccaneer, he will be a high upside wide receiver 3 in this contest. The next matchup we have is the San Francisco 49ers on the road against the Arizona Cardinals. The big news for the San Francisco side of things is of course Brandon Ayuk and his emergence as a fantasy superstar. We have him ranked in the top 10 this week, and it should come as no surprise. Brandon Ayuk has shown the combination of an extremely high ceiling as well as an extremely high floor. The way he gets his production is in the area of yards after catch, making him a matchup nightmare for virtually any defense. Ayuk himself, from a production standpoint, has had 73 or more receiving yards in each contest since week 7. Through that same span, he's also caught a touchdown in 4 of 6 games, and over the past 5 weeks has been averaging over 20 fantasy points per game. That all adds up to Brandon Ayuk being an auto start, and when it comes to Kendrick Bourne, who is coming off of a very positive performance, we do have to take it with a grain of salt. A lot of his production did come off of a Hail Mary pass late in the game, so when we're looking at wide receiver options on the San Francisco side of things, it's really Brandon Ayuk and nobody else. On the other side of the ball for Arizona, similarly, we only have one player in consideration, that's DeAndre Hopkins, who will come in with a top 5 ranking this week. Looking for options outside of him, it gets really thin. Kyler Murray, even last week, coming off of a phenomenal performance. For the other wide receivers in this offense outside of DeAndre Hopkins, it really didn't equate to a lot of fantasy production. In fact, no other receiver outside of DeAndre Hopkins was able to eclipse 40 receiving yards, which is pretty surprising considering exactly how well Kyler Murray played and the type of upside that was shown through the air from DeAndre Hopkins. For those reasons though, we can't consider starting any other wide receiver outside of him, so we're going to move into the next one. Miami Dolphins versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Let's start with Miami. Wide receivers of note we have to keep an eye on is the health of Devontae Parker. At this point, we're not 100% sure if he's going to start or not. If he does start, while this is a very positive matchup for fantasy, Devontae Parker will be coming into this matchup with a significant amount of risk. Parker has had stints in the past where he has started games with questionable health and had early exits in games. I'm not sure if I could afford that type of risk in my starting lineup if I have better options, but if he is available, expect him to be ranked somewhere in that flex territory. Outside of him, the only other player of note for Miami would be Lynn Bowden. Theoretically, this is a revenge game, but don't let that have any impact on whether you start Lynn Bowden or not. I'm not exactly thrilled about him in this matchup. The only true benefit I could see to trying to fit him in is to try to take advantage of the fact that he can be started in the running back slot. We know across the season, a lot of running backs have been lost, leaving gaping holes in rosters, so if he is a safe floor player you'd want to plug in to try to shore up one of those holes, that I could understand. Moving over to the Raiders though, Marcus Mariota, the big news here is that he is starting. He looked impeccable in his first game back. That does lend itself to a bit of additional upside for the players in this offense. That's mainly going to benefit Darren Waller. As for the wide receivers, there's really only one we're considering, that's Nelson Aguilar. His volume in the passing game has been pretty high over the past 3 contests, totaling 28 total targets through that span. But once again, take it with a grain of salt. 2 of those games were with Derek Carr, and while Marcus Mariota did look good in his last performance, we really haven't seen enough from him to feel confident, especially at this stage of the season. Regardless though, Nelson Aguilar should make a decent player to start in the flex spot if you are out of options. We do have him ranked outside the top 40 though, and if your team has made it this far, it's possible you do have better players to put in. Moving into the next matchup, we have the Chicago Bears on the road against the Jacksonville Jaguars. This one is extremely simple, so we'll gloss over it a bit. When it comes to Jacksonville, yes, we have Gardner Minshew back, but we really can't trust any of the wide receivers in this offense. This offense overall has been looking dysfunctional to say the least, and heading into this matchup, one of the worst possible matchups we could ask for against the Chicago Bears, putting our faith in these receivers that are already risky to begin with, it's just not a winning proposition. On the other side of the ball though, for Chicago, we have Allen Robinson, who once again comes into this game with a phenomenal matchup. The Jacksonville Jaguars have allowed the most receiving touchdowns per game, the 11th most receptions per game, and Allen Robinson, despite coming off of a mere 4 reception game against Minnesota, he has had 6 or more receptions in the 6 games prior. He has also had 3 receiving touchdowns over the past 4 weeks, so we have A-Rob ranked as the wide receiver 6 this week, someone with a safe floor and a ton of upside to match. Moving into the next game, we have the Indianapolis Colts versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. I would be a complete liar if I wouldn't tell you I was a bit concerned with the floor of T.Y. Hilton this week. This is a matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers, one of the teams that's been playing the best against the wide receiver position over the second half of the season. Not only that though, we also have T.Y. Hilton, who has seen fewer targets in each consecutive game over the past 3 weeks. Even heading into last game, yes, his performance, 4 receptions for over 70 receiving yards looks good on paper, but we can't forget coming down to the final few minutes, T.Y. Hilton was held to just 3 receptions for just over 30 yards. Last week though, Hilton had a positive matchup. This week, he won't have that luxury. So for me, the risk in the start of T.Y. Hilton, while it's certainly worth the reward, you overall just have to temper your expectations. We're not starting any Indianapolis Colt receiver outside of Hilton though. And on the other side of the ball, for Pittsburgh, while we also aren't thrilled with this matchup against the Colts, this is more going to increase the variance for players like Juju Smith-Schuster, and even more so for Chase Claypool. But when it comes to Deontay Johnson, the target machine on the season, we really should have no concerns despite this poor matchup. Deontay Johnson has already proved to overcome through volume, even in other difficult matchups across this season, and excluding the game he was benched for an entire half against Buffalo where he had a total of 7 targets, 6 of the other 7 games he has received double digits. As for Juju and Chase Claypool, there will be really no safety we can guarantee in their starts. The edge for both of them is going to be in the favor of Juju, who is targeted on more of those short and intermediate routes, an area where the Indianapolis Colts defense has shown some struggles. Regardless though, both Juju and Chase Claypool are going to be ranked more as flex players, ones that we can't really guarantee their production, but players ranked in that starter territory nonetheless. New York Giants versus the Baltimore Ravens. We're starting on the New York side of things. All the information we have at this point is that Daniel Jones is slated to be the starter. Daniel Jones, as we know, is dealing with both a hamstring and an ankle injury. In addition to that, while we've seen Daniel Jones on the field, he hasn't looked all that great. He has remained scoreless through the air in each of his past 3 contests, last throwing a touchdown pass all the way back in Week 9. For those reasons, we can't say for certain it's a massive upgrade going from Colt McCoy to Daniel Jones. I will say, however, working in the favor of these New York Giants receivers is that the Baltimore Ravens are one of the past defenses that have been trending down the most over the past several weeks. When we compile the offensive struggles of the New York Giants to the recent beatability of the Baltimore Ravens pass defense, we're going to meet somewhere in the middle, making these Giants receivers players we really wouldn't consider starting, somewhere on the cusp of flex type starters. We still have them both ranked outside of the top 40 though. Start them at your own risk, but definitely players that could pay off to start. On the other side of the ball though, for Baltimore, Marquise Brown at this point has shown enough consistency for us to be able to trust him in that flex spot, much more so than those of the Giants receivers. Marquise Brown, heading into last week's matchup, had come into that game with 3 consecutive games posting a receiving touchdown. While he did not keep up that trend in Week 15, it is still worth noting he was able to finish the game with 6 receptions for 98 yards, and his overall involvement in this offense has been consistent for each of the past 4 weeks. Through that span, he's received no fewer than 6 targets, and with a player like Marquise Brown, 6 targets is really all you need. So we're ranking him inside the top 30 this week, so if you own him, feel pretty good about starting him. We're moving into the next matchup, and it's a banger. It's the Atlanta Falcons versus the Kansas City Chiefs. Even though these are 2 offenses considered high-powered, there's really only 2 wide receivers in this contest we're considering starting, 1 on each side. We're starting with Atlanta, and this is of course assuming that Julio Jones is going to be held out. He has not yet practiced this week and has been ruled out in each of the past 2 games, leaving Calvin Ridley to lead this team from the receiver position. Heading into this matchup, he is going to draw one of the most negative matchups he's had over several weeks, but regardless, Calvin Ridley is still going to garner a wide receiver 1 ranking just based out of of necessity for volume that this team will need to push the ball downfield. The level of success that Matt Ryan has had when targeting other wide receivers, it hasn't been all that high, making the necessity for the role of Calvin Ridley very high in this matchup, especially against Kansas City, a team likely to be leading by a significant margin for much of this game. So if you own Calvin Ridley, once again get excited for his start. And on the other side of the ball for Kansas City, it's Tyreek Hill and nobody else. Tyreek Hill heading into this matchup has the potential to post one of his best fantasy performances of the season. This is of course against the Atlanta Falcons, a team that has been decimated by wide receivers all season long. Tyreek Hill's skill set matches up very well against the weakness of this passing defense. So the upside, the safety, and the floor, Tyreek Hill is going to come in with the entire package this week. The next matchup we have is the Cleveland Browns versus the New York Jets, and I'm really loving the start for Jarvis Landry in this matchup. Jarvis Landry has been one of the few players playing extremely safe and consistent through the fantasy playoffs, and heading into this week in a matchup against the New York Jets, he's going to look to continue that trend against one of the league's worst passing defenses. The New York Jets defense overall is a complete funnel for passing production. They're pretty limiting to opposing rushers on the ground, which lends itself to better performances for the quarterbacks as well as receivers on this team. And with Jarvis Landry, a player who has averaged 9 targets over each of the last 3 contests, he's also caught a receiving touchdown in 3 of the past 4 contests. It should come as no surprise we have Landry ranked inside of the top 20. For wide receiver needy teams or desperate owners, Rashard Higgins is definitely startable as well. We have him ranked inside the top 36 this week, and it all comes down to the exact same things, the weakness of this New York Jets pass defense, and let's be honest, Baker Mayfield has been playing pretty darn well himself. On the other side of the ball for the New York Jets, the only receiver we're really considering starting is Jamison Crowder. I understand a lot of people are pretty pumped about Crowder in this matchup, and while over the sample of the entire season, he's been the leading receiver on this team, when it comes to safety and consistency week over week, Jamison Crowder kind of has the illusion of a safe floor player despite actually not being one. Don't get me wrong though, this is still a very beatable matchup, but when it comes to beatable matchups, that does also assist the other wide receivers on this team. Jamison Crowder at times has not been the leading receiver on this team, which may come into play in this matchup. We're not using that as a reason though to start the other wide receivers. It's basically Jamison Crowder or nobody else, but we do have to temper our expectations and understand the floor for Jamison Crowder may be lower than meets the eye. Moving into the next matchup, we have the Cincinnati Bengals versus the Houston Texans. I'm going to start on the Houston side of things, and I believe this matchup, out of all of the most recent matchups, could be one that lends itself better to a player like Brandon Cooks. The past 3 contests, the Houston Texans have faced the Colts twice as well as the Chicago Bears. 3 defenses very limiting to opposing wide receiver ones, and Brandon Cooks as a result really hasn't seen his ceiling, a ceiling we projected to be pretty high without Will Fuller. Since this is going to be the softest matchup he's seen, he is going to come in with additional upside this week. Our ranking for him is going to be that of a back-end wide receiver too, but don't sleep on the type of upside he brings to the table. As for Keke Coutee though, I do think he is going to come into this one with a bit of additional risk. First off, this isn't a matchup against the Indianapolis Colts, a matchup he's proven to smash each and every time he plays them, and if I'm expecting the matchup to be better for a player like Brandon Cooks and them to be able to find more success in that area, that would ultimately be at the detriment of Keke Coutee, a player who just fumbled the ball into the red zone, which has to have an impact on Deshaun Watson's willingness to target him in that area once again this week. Regardless though, Keke Coutee can still be started in the flex. I can't say the same for Chad Hansen, who admittedly has been very safe and consistent over the past 3 weeks, but he is coming off of a game in which he had 3 receiving targets. Had he not scored, we would be singing a different tune. For that, I am going to suggest leaving him on the bench, but for Coutee owners and Brandon Cooks owners, you definitely have something to be excited about. On the Cincinnati side, it's very simple. It's really hard to get excited about any receiver in this contest just due to the lack in talent at the quarterback position. The target distribution amongst each of these receivers hasn't been in the favor of just one of them, so it's difficult for us to put a stake on exactly which one's going to have the better day. Ultimately, this will render each one of them to nothing more than a flex, but considering this is such a plus matchup against the Houston Texans, the upside for each one of them starting in the flex can certainly be there. The floor, however, is definitely called into question, making them one of the more risky flex options you could put in there, but in a game in which the Houston Texans are going to be nearly 9-point favorites, the potential for one of them to pop off is certainly there. Alright guys, we're moving Going into the next matchup, we have the Denver Broncos on the road against the LA Chargers. I do want to start with speaking on the LA Chargers, and the biggest news here, of course, is the massive dud from Keenan Allen, who was put on record saying, "Don't sit me, start me this week," and proceeded to post a dud. I know a lot of people may have had an early exit to the playoffs just due to that reason, but if you are a Keenan Allen owner, were able to overcome that disappointing performance, don't hesitate on locking Keenan Allen in this week. The matchup against the Denver Broncos is actually one that fares extremely well for the skill set of Allen. It is true that the Denver Broncos pass defense has only allowed 2 total touchdowns to wide receivers since all the way back in week 9, rendering teams scoreless to that position in 4 of the past 6 contests. But one area that has been somewhat of an Achilles heel as of late has been the area of volume that the Denver Broncos pass defense has been allowing. They allowed 19 receptions to wide receivers back in week 14, proceeded to outdo that with 23 receptions allowed in week 15. And when it comes to Keenan Allen, a player we know who gets his production from volume, that's going to match up extremely well this week. Keep in mind though, we can't be certain that he won't be somewhat limited when it comes to his overall snaps, which will increase his risk coming into this matchup, knocking him outside of the top 12 in our rankings. But if he's healthy, he's good to go, and he's playing on a lot of snaps, expect an extremely solid performance. As for Mike Williams, the only other wide receiver in this offense we would consider starting, he has had a combined 2 targets over the past 2 weeks, which makes him impossible to trust heading into this matchup. And while some other receivers in this offense have stepped up in the place of the limitations of these 2 receivers, it hasn't been enough of a sample for us to feel confident in starting them. On the other side of the ball for the Denver Broncos, we're not trusting any wide receiver in this matchup. While both Tim Patrick and KJ Hamler have had their days, predicting when they're going to pop off in their matchups has been extremely difficult. The volume going to each receiver hasn't been high, or at least has not been consistently high, so the trust factor we're going to have with each of these receivers is extremely low, and the matchup against the LA Chargers is one of the worst matchups we could look for. Up next, we have the Carolina Panthers versus the Washington Football Team. Overall, since this is such a poor matchup for the Carolina Panthers receivers we've trusted across the entire season, we are going to have to downgrade them a bit in the rankings. I will say overall, this matchup does lend itself better to players like DJ Moore, Curtis Samuel, a receiver who has a strong ability in yards after catch, who gets rushes out of the backfield. They should have a much easier time getting him involved. For that, we do have him ranked inside the top 36, one of the more premier flex plays despite this being a poor matchup. Robbie Anderson still inside the top 30, but the edge certainly goes to DJ Moore, who we still have ranked inside of the top 20. As for Washington, it was very promising to see Terry McLaurin garner such a high target market share once again with Dwayne Haskins. Heading into this matchup, it won't be ideal. It's not going to be as strong of a matchup as he had last week against Seattle, but Dwayne Haskins, shaking some of the rust off, may have a bit more in the tank than he did have last week. We do have Terry McLaurin ranked inside of the top 15. He should be started on your roster and trusted as more of a wide receiver too in this matchup, but one with plenty of upside nonetheless. Dallas Cowboys versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Starting with Philadelphia, the biggest news has to be Jalen Hurts and the revival of this offense. While it is true Jalen Hurts is going to put this team into scoring position, that isn't necessarily going to result in a solid start for the fantasy options at the wide receiver position. The way that Jalen Hurts has been spreading around the ball, it's been pretty consistent across each of the wide receivers, especially in the area of the red zone. And while that does help Philadelphia in the ability to put points on the board, it doesn't help for fantasy when we can't say with certainty which player is going to lead in red zone targets this upcoming week. The overall volume going to the wide receiver position has been in the favor of Jalen Reagor, making him the more safe player to start, but regardless, we don't even have him ranked in flex territory, so despite this being a very positive matchup, and while we do expect Jalen Hurts to have a significant amount of production to go around, guessing exactly which receiver will garner what target market share in what area of the field, it's going to be too difficult to predict to put our faith into, rendering none of them startable. On the other side of the ball, for the Dallas Cowboys, we basically have the same situation we've had for several weeks under Andy Dalton. The target market share going to each receiver, it's going to be consistently spread around. This does make the variance for each receiver that you're going to be starting, CeeDee Lamb, Amari Cooper, and Michael Gallup, to be high variance week over week. We did see that variance come into play with Amari Cooper last week, finishing with a mere 3+ fantasy points in a PPR scoring format. Regardless of that though, we still do have him ranked as the highest of all the receivers in this offense, defense and one we feel most comfortable about the floor of. CeeDee Lamb, we do know, is going to be a threat to score at any part of the field, making him always a player we like to put in our flex. We like to have our players in the flex position have that type of ceiling, and CeeDee Lamb certainly brings it to the table. A distant third is going to be Michael Gallup. Michael Gallup, we have seen in flashes have his games, but when CeeDee Lamb is on the field alongside Amari Cooper, Michael Gallup just seems to be the odd man out. With all of that information just provided to you, the overall rankings we have for each player is Amari Cooper just outside the top 20, CeeDee Lamb just inside the top 30, and Michael Gallup, the player trailing behind, he is going to be ranked outside of the top 50. The next matchup we have is the LA Rams versus the Seattle Seahawks. Now, something interesting about this matchup is that it mimics the matchup we saw previously with Seattle versus Washington. We have two wide receivers in Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf who've been popping off all season long, but now unfortunately they're facing one of the league's best pass defense when it comes to defending opposing wide receivers. And what that adds up to is, again, we have to temper our expectations. When it comes to variance, we know Tyler Lockett is going to come in with a much higher level of variance than that of DK Metcalf, but with the LA Rams allowing a receiving touchdown to a wide receiver in a mere 5 games this season, the floor for both of these wide receivers is going to come in much lower. Russell Wilson, having played an extremely stout wide receiver defense last week, should have that as an advantage playing in his favor heading into this matchup. So for DK Metcalf, we still do have him ranked as a wide receiver 1 coming into this one with a bit of a low floor though. But as for Tyler Lockett, he is going to be more of that risky back end 2 this week. On the other side of the ball for the LA Rams, you have to be thrilled about getting this matchup in the championships for both Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods. Try not to concern yourself too much with the lack of performance we saw from Jared Goff in that matchup against the New York Jets. That was more of an anomaly than anything. Heading into this matchup against Seattle, a team that has allowed the most fantasy points to that position, you have to be excited about the upside and the floor of both Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp, both players we have ranked as wide receiver 2s. Robert Woods, a more mid-grade, safe floor wide receiver 2. Cooper Kupp, the player with undeniably more upside, but a lower floor wide receiver 2, one we have ranked as a back-end one. Alright guys, we're moving into the Sunday night matchup, which is the Tennessee Titans versus the Green Bay Packers. Starting on the Tennessee side of things, we have a very high projected total in this game, which lends itself to more production to go around. Both Corey Davis and AJ Brown have proven to be the target funnels for this offense, which bodes very well for this floor despite this being an overall more difficult matchup. When it comes to AJ Brown himself, it's hard not to rank him as a wide receiver 1. This is a player, of course, who has had 10 receiving touchdowns across his 12 starts this season, and despite the Packers ranking inside the top 10 at mitigating fantasy points to the position, the Green Bay Packers have still allowed a receiving touchdown to a wide receiver in 10 of 14 games this year. AJ Brown, being a touchdown machine, matches up very well in that aspect, and Corey Davis, a player we may be a little less thrilled about, is still going to get a top 24 ranking, making him an auto start for most teams as well. On the Green Bay side of things, it's extremely simple. It's Devontae Adams and nobody else. The target market share for both Allen Lazard and Marquez Valdes-Scantling has been somewhat flip-flopping. Throw Robert Tonyan in there, and even though this is a really positive matchup for wide receivers overall, and there is a lot of fantasy points to be had with a high projected total, trusting Allen Lazard is still going to be too risky of an endeavor for us to put our faith into. But as for Devontae Adams, we have him ranked as the number 1 fantasy wide receiver this week. Moving into the final matchup, we have the New England Patriots versus the Buffalo Bills. The Buffalo Bills are going to be nearly a touchdown favorite in this one, but don't let that be overly concerning with the potential volume for the wide receivers this week. Buffalo has been trending towards near the league lead when it comes to percentage of pass plays versus running plays, and with Stephon Gilmore placed on the IR this week, there brings in a ton of upside for both Cole Beasley and the opportunities open for Stephon Diggs. Stephon Diggs, for that reason, not having Gilmore lining up across him, is going to garner a top 5 ranking this week. Beasley coming in with a bit lower of a floor than that of Diggs just due to the lack of volume, increasing his variance, is still going to be borderline top 30 this week, and with the type of upside Beasley has proven to bring to the table in each and every matchup, I would be trying to get him in despite this overall being a negative matchup for him, so do what you can to get him in the lineup. As for New England, there's really only one player we're considering, that's going to be Jacoby Myers. Myers is coming off of a resurgence from a volume perspective, coming in with 10 targets last week. He caught 7 of those for 111 yards. This matchup against Buffalo, while certainly not strong wrong on paper, the fact that the Buffalo Bills are coming into this matchup as a touchdown favorite on the road, it does lend itself to a more pass-friendly game script later in this game, which could promote a better volume situation for Jakobi Meyers. For that, we do have him ranked inside the top 40, a player you could put into your flex, and no other receiver outside of Meyers are we really considering. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hoped you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.